Thank you very much, Sue. It's always a bit exhausting when you hear this list of all the things that you've done, and for over such a length of time, I suppose, as well. So good morning. It's a bit of a no pressure being the first speaker, but and I'm just so delighted to get the invitation to speak at this event. I think these are great events, and how fantastic that this one's in Cardiff as well. That's just brilliant for us in Wales. And so what I'm going to do is focus on why it's vital to consider the well-being of midwives. I guess this is an area I've been working in for about 20 years now, and I think maybe I'm feeling at last maybe the moment is here, maybe people are really beginning to listen now. Because I think that unless we support, and unless midwives feel valued and supported in their work, they're not going to be able to give that high quality care to women and their babies. And so we need to care for the carers. We need to midwife the midwives so that they stay in midwifery and they give the care that they want to give. You know, I teach the student midwives, they come in, they're desperate, they really want to get into midwifery. And they're so passionate about it. And it's so sad when you see people getting disillusioned. And the report that Sue referred to, the English RCM report, State of the Maternity Services, does make this point that even though now we've got increased numbers of students coming through, our challenge now is to keep midwives in the profession. We know that there are high levels of stress and burnout. But what I want to do is focus on the positive side. So what I'm going to do is focus on how midwives can keep going and not just survive and get to the end of the day or the end of the week, but actually thrive in the workplace. And I'm sure we all know midwives like this. I'm actually looking around the room, I know quite a lot of faces, and I know there are midwives here who seem to be able to bounce back. It's, you know, everybody works in a tough workplace, particularly those of you out there in practice. But some people seem to be able to just keep that enthusiasm going and be able to kind of bounce back and share that enthusiasm with others. So what is it about those midwives? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some research. I'm not going to go into a lot of methodological detail first thing in the morning. But I'm just going to give you a snapshot of two studies which looked at resilience and sustainability in maternity care. And at the nub of what the midwives were talking about in both studies was, this is what keeps me in maternity care and in midwifery. And I think that's our big challenge. How can we keep midwives in midwifery? So the two studies, one was a study of resilience, and it was conducted by myself and my colleague, Dr. Lucy Warren at Cardiff University, and we looked at UK midwives' experience of resilience. And the other was conducted in New Zealand by a team of New Zealand researchers, and they focused on caseload carrying midwives in the New Zealand system, and they were looking at sustainability. And there were many findings. We ended up presenting after each other at an ICM conference, and so much of their data collected in New Zealand was like Lucy and I's data collected in the UK, that there were so many similar themes. We thought we need to write a paper together to look at these two things, resilience and sustainability. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. So what's it like at the moment in UK midwifery? Well, you don't need me to tell you that it's pretty tough out there. So you only have to turn on the news, don't you? It always feels like there's another bad news story about the NHS, about healthcare, but also, and very topical at the moment, about maternity care. So we know there's concerns about underfunding, lack of staff, lack of resources, changing goalposts, unmet needs, unachievable targets. And it can sometimes feel like the list of problems is endless and really daunting. But I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on how we can get from this, feeling like, oh no, I don't know if I can hang on in this job much longer, where midwives feel overwhelmed by all those challenges and are even thinking of leaving. How can we get from that to one where it's possible to find work fulfilling and rewarding? And of course, ideally, what we'd be doing is tackling those big systemic problems. We would be getting more midwives into practice, well-resourced, working in midwifery models of care and keeping them in the job. But that's not going to happen overnight, is it? And whoever's in government, I think, you know, we're not going to be able to quick fix those problems. So I think what we need to do is also support midwives in developing their own individual, personal kind of toolkit of resources to help them get through what is actually quite a tough job at the moment. And so what I've done in this presentation is just draw on what do midwives who feel that they're resilient, what do they tell us about their practice? And what do the midwives who stay in the job and feel that their practice is sustainable, what do they tell us? So just a quick reminder about what resilience is. It's a really popular buzzword. I just was listening to the news this morning. It feels like it's the word you get, resilience is used all the time, maybe a bit loosely sometimes. But the psychologists would tell us it's a bit like this little seedling pushing up against all the odds. There's a kind of, concrete, and there's a crack, and a little seedling manages to come up through that and thrive and blossom. And so the psychologists would say it's consistent and positive adaptation to adversity, to challenges, without any residual significant psychological or physiological harm. And how I think of that is just doing better than you'd expect in the circumstances. So sustainability is an interesting, different kind of term. But interestingly, they both come from environmental science, from ecology. And we tend to think of sustainability as being about the planet, about our environment. But actually, you can also apply what it means to individuals and to a profession, because what it means is the capacity to maintain balance. So we think of the planet maintaining balance and homeostasis and enduring, carrying on. But you can think of that about you and as an individual, can't you? How can you maintain your balance and how can you endure? And as a profession, how can midwifery as a profession? And we've had some challenges over the last few years, as I'm sure a lot of you know. How can we maintain our balance and how can we endure as a profession? So the two studies, just very quickly. The UK study was a qualitative descriptive study. It was funded by Royal College of Midwives, and we conducted a month-long online discussion group. We asked for midwives, people to take part who were working in clinical hands-on practice, who'd been in practice for 15 years or more, and who would describe themselves as resilient. So we went to the people who said, yeah, I think I'm a pretty resilient person. And then we asked them, well, how has that happened? How do you think you're resilient? Why has that happened? What's happened to you in your life? What do you think the barriers are to becoming resilient? And what facilitates it? So they were our key questions. The New Zealand study, also qualitative, descriptive, they did interviews with midwives who were working as the lead maternity carer. So these are case-loading midwives who'd been in practice for more than 8 years. They provided continuity of care. They were in quite a different situation than a lot of the midwives in our study. And they asked them, what sustains you in your practice? And what prevents you getting burnt out? So some similar questions, but different. And very interestingly, there were 4 themes that came up in both the studies. Both lots of midwives talked about their love and passion and joy for midwifery, and Sue has alluded to this already this morning. They said, this is something I draw on when times are tough. They talked about the importance of looking after yourself, about self-care, about self-determination and relationships, and that relationships are really important to sustain you in your practice. And I'm going to go through each of those with just a few quotes from the data. It's a really short presentation. This is always frustrating, and so you have to wave at me if I'm still talking at 10 o'clock, because I can get carried away. But because some of the data is just so lovely. These were the UK midwives, these 2 quotes. And this quote, I guess I love more than anything in our data. And Lucy's husband, Tim, did this fantastic illustration of it for us, because this midwife said, a midwife is what I am. It just is who I is. It's written through my body like a stick of rock. And I say that to all the students here. This is what we hope at Cardiff, and I'm sure in the other universities across the UK, we hope to engender this sense of identity in our students. And then, it's actually, you're giving a fantastic public service. The midwives talked about the moral worth of the job. It's not like working in John Lewis. you know, John Lewis is a great place, but it's not like being a midwife. So this is a fantastic job. It's varied, it's interesting, it can be fun, but most of all, it accords with my sense of purpose in life and my sense of the importance of public service, giving something to the community. And the New Zealand midwives, this is interesting because they were working in a continuity of carer scheme. They were able to develop these very close relationships with women and their families, more than some of the midwives who took part in the UK study. But this midwife said, the thing that keeps me in midwifery is the first time a mother looks at her baby. That's what keeps me. I just think of that moment when I'm having a tough day, and then I bring that moment to mind. How special is that? There's nothing else like that. So self-care, in both groups, they talked about the importance of looking after yourself. That it's so important to... I always think of this as a bit like when you're on the plane and they say, put your oxygen, if you've got children with you, put your oxygen mask on first before you put on your child's. You actually have to look after yourself. You can't go giving out to all these wonderful women and their families. First of all, you have to make sure that you're okay, so you'll have nothing to give out to them. So look after your own needs and manage expectations. Manage others' expectations of you. But I must say, for myself, being honest, I shouldn't be doing this, should I? It's self-expectations can be hugely draining of us. We all kind of expect ourselves to be superwoman, to be the most fantastic midwife ever, and the most fantastic partner and mum and daughter and whoever else we are in our lives. So we have to manage those expectations. We're only human. Look for support from our family and friends and accept the support that's offered to us. That can often be harder, can't it? Remember that there are critical moments in our lives. In our study, midwives talked about when they were newly qualified. It can be a really challenging time when you feel like, oh, I'm really out there now, I'm qualified as a midwife. And also when you've had a really tough day, there's been a very difficult, perhaps an emergency in practice, a clinical incident that's been challenging. So take care of yourself, particularly at those times. Get a sense of perspective on what's got on and use positive mood changes. So these are some examples from the data from our study. This midwife talked about getting this sense of perspective at the end of a day. Some midwives talked about going to the gym, going for a run. This midwife just said, actually, very simply, I just get on the bus and the train and I just watch other people, and it helps get it all back in balance. What seemed to me the most dreadful thing that has happened, actually, there are other things going on in the world. And then the mood changes. As I said, people talked about the gym, going running. People also talked about chocolate and wine and things that maybe in the long term aren't quite so positive for you, your health. But one thing we didn't expect was dog walking. And so if there are dog walkers in the audience, this may sort of tick a box here that you get the exercise and you've also got this silent companion who adores you and doesn't ask difficult questions. Self-determination. This is very interesting. I think it came up particularly strongly in the New Zealand midwife study because they were able to have a lot of autonomy in their work because of the way they work, which is more like an independent midwife. But in both groups, they talked about the importance of getting a work-life balance, not letting one suffer, and knowing your boundaries as a midwife. And the New Zealand midwives said how important this was for them, that they couldn't give their all over and over again, time and time again, because they had their own families, they had their own friends, their own concerns. So it was important for them to be able to develop those very compassionate and boundaries that were compassionate for themselves and compassionate for the women they were looking after. And then controlling what is possible in your life. It doesn't always feel possible when you're working on a labour ward in the NHS in the UK to control much about your work, but control what you can. And the psychologist would say, control what you can and accept what you can't control. Just don't get yourself fretted about it. It's like sitting in a traffic jam, isn't it? It's like there's no point in getting all pent up because it's not going to make any difference to the traffic jam. And find a niche for yourself. Find your role. I know there's people here that have managed to carve out wonderful roles, consultant midwives, specialist midwives. Find your thing in midwifery, which is your place, where you have something very special to offer. Relationships. I'm really fascinated by the importance of relationships, and if you've got good relationships, we often just take it for granted. It's only when things aren't great that we realise that how important relationships are. So in our study, they really talked a lot about their colleagues, the importance of getting good social support from colleagues and offering support as well, that's kind of mutually reinforcing. So this midwife talked about the importance of talking over issues with trusted colleagues, finding the people you can trust, where you can really make yourself a bit vulnerable and say how difficult you found something. And midwife 4 here talks about younger colleagues. They were very aware, because they'd all been in practice for 15 years or more, some of them a lot more, they were very aware of the younger midwives coming through and how it behoved them as the oldies, they called themselves, to look after and nurture the younger midwives so that they won't become frustrated. They could see the danger of younger midwives thinking, oh, below this for a lark, I'll go and find something easier. I'll go to John Lewis. It's not so demanding. The midwives in the New Zealand study, because they were doing caseload carrying, particularly did talk about the relationships with their colleagues, but they also talked about good relationships with women and families, and how that got them through. And often the women would turn up. The women valued them so much, were so keen to see them. And they said, that's why I stay in this job. It's for the clients. So both kinds of relationships there. So to go back to the list again, it was this love, passion and joy in midwifery, the importance of looking after yourself, being able to have self-determination as much as possible, and the importance of relationships. So Lucy and I, from our findings, we came up with what we called the Resilient Repertoire, or toolkit. And the Cardiff students will know this well because they have it drummed into them. So we've incorporated this in our Bachelor of Midwifery programme. All the students are introduced to it. It's longer than this looks, but it's not good for a slide. So basically what we do with the students is that they are introduced to the toolkit, the repertoire, and then we work on them. They have resilience sessions throughout their 3 years, and we work in small groups and we work on case studies to think about how could this midwife, what's going on here for this midwife and the other people in the setting, and what would be a resilience response here. And so what we're doing is drawing on our findings, so this is evidence-based, and it's about gaining perspective through reflection, seeking support and offering support to others, finding positive mood changes that work for you. It's no good taking out a gym membership. This is my message to myself. It's no good doing that if you really actually don't like that environment and what you'd much rather just go for a walk around the park. Go and do that. And appreciate your own strengths and your own abilities, and also the areas that you find a bit more tricky. Anticipate stress, avoid unreasonable self-expectations, look after yourself. In Buddhism, they talk about loving kindness to yourself, and I think it's something we should all really think about. How can you be kind to yourself? We can be kind to everybody else out there, but self-kindness is a more challenging thing, I think. Value the work you do, control what you can, and accept what you can't. So I think hopefully what I've tried to do here is pull out the things that I think are really important about how you keep going. So there are things there about being resilient. There are things about how you can keep your own practice and the wider practice of midwifery sustainable. And to me, running through all these quotes, there's compassion. And it's not the elephant in the room, it's the opposite of that. It's just like, it's so obvious that we don't even see it. It's like fish can't see water, isn't it? So compassion to the women we care for, to our colleagues, to our managers, to the policymakers. I'm not going to say to the politicians, that's a bit too much for me. And self-compassion, I think, is hugely important. And, I think it can be seen as a bit fluffy, the kind of pink fluffy stuff that, surely that's not really important. What we need is protocols. And to me, these things are the things that are really vital in keeping midwifery sustainable as a profession and safe and giving this very good, high-quality care to women and their babies and their families. And my hope is that if we can draw on this body of knowledge, we won't just have one little seedling pushing up through the pavement, but we'll have a whole lovely bouquet of daisies all pushing up. This will be the midwifery profession. We'll all be blossoming there as a resilient and a compassionate and a sustainable profession. And I think that's the last slide. Diolch yn fawr. And this is just a thank you to all the people, to Lucy particularly, and then to Susan Crowther and the New Zealand team, and of course all the midwives that took part in these studies. And there are references there. We've got a really interesting, I know Sheena's here somewhere, I think. There she is. There it is. So the Resilient Repertoire is in Raw Behind the Silence. So we wrote an academic paper, which is there in midwifery, and we know that a lot of midwives are not going to read the academic paper unless they're doing a master's or bachelor's course. But something like Raw Behind the Silence, which if you haven't read it, I'm going to give it a plug. It's a fantastic book, real kind of bite-sized chunk chapters. And we were delighted when Sheena and Sue asked us to write a chapter in there. And it allowed us to discuss in a little bit more depth the model that we were developing. I think I'm fantastic timing. Thank you very much.